If you have any questions as she presents on this topic, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll be monitoring that. I know we'll have some time for discussion at the end, but also if you have questions throughout, let us know. All right, Shawna, go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amber. As she said, if you have questions in the middle, please feel free to put up your hand, put it in the chat, because I'd much rather talk about the questions during the process. I'm totally okay with that, and think that'll be a lot better experience for everybody. So a huge thank you to Amber for coordinating this series and also for inviting me on. What you guys don't know about me is that science communication is kind of a passion of mine, but it's not one that I initially pursued. I'm a journalist by training, and I pursued it for a number of reasons, many of which is that I'm interested in connecting with people, and I'm interested in informing minds, and I'm interested in telling really good stories that make people feel compelled to care about something or to take action for something. My first gig was as a newspaper reporter in a small city in Iowa, and I had the weekend beat, which meant that I went to the police station every weekend and got the arrest log. But I was fond of quipping that I had the festival beat. This is not an insult to Iowa, I promise. Iowa throws the best festivals on the planet, and I miss them dearly. They celebrate watermelon and strawberry and sweet corn. And this is just the pile of corn that they bring in for the shucking contest for the sweet corn festival. And we see who can shuck the most ears of corn. It's hard not to love something like that. And it's hard not to love telling those kind of stories. But the boots on the ground at these festivals and at the other stories that I did, because I did do more than festivals, were hugely transformative in who I became as a communicator. Because you make a lot of mistakes initially, and it is your job to represent what people are telling you. And when you get it wrong, you are 100% going to hear about it. So you become very aware of the questions you're asking, of the way you're representing information, and you become more careful about making sure you understood what somebody else said to you. This, I just have to point out, is pretty much what most reporters' pads look like. And if you can happen to read it, you get bonus points because, you're scribbling really, really fast. After doing this for 4 years, I transitioned. Oh no, I forgot. Because of all that boots on the ground experience, I still have this hanging in my office. It's right over here, actually. That journalism is a tough job with pretty crappy pay and insane pressure. And on the other hand, everybody hates you, right? You get so used to this mentality of people giving you the feedback for the job that you give that you just kind of embrace it and turn it into a win for you. So that way you're doing the best job you can for that public audience. After I was a reporter, I transitioned to the copy desk. So I was editing other people's stories. I was laying them out. I was making them fit. And when you're doing that, you end up recognizing where other people are making pitfalls in communications as well. So you become very good at seeing how other people are asking questions, maybe where they're missing something or where you have questions and you have to call them to fill the gaps. As you guys probably know, the newspaper industry, of course, shrank. And when it was my turn to be let go, I ended up landing at a gig at the School of Natural Resources here at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. What I learned very, very quickly is that while I knew how to communicate to a mass communication audience, I knew, and I was really, really interested in science. I loved the climate change stories. I loved the health stories. I loved the endangered species stories, and made sure they always had a home in the newspaper when I was on the desk. But when I got to SNR, I realized I didn't know how to read a science paper at all. And so I spent months trying to get up to speed on how to take science, understand the science that I was supposed to be writing about and talking about, and making sure I was reflecting it in a way that respected it, but made it accessible to our public audiences. I read some blogs at the time for how to read those science papers, start at the end and then go back to the beginning. And I remember thinking, oh my God, why is it taking me 4.5 hours to understand 26 pages? This is insane. But it's what you had to do. I'm Googling phrases to understand and try to translate that into layman's terms. and verifying that, of course, with the scientists who are doing that work. Because of these experiences, of course, I have turned into a science communicator, and I really, really value my role in helping make sure that everybody understands what it is that scientists are working on, especially in my agency now at Game and Parks, because it's so incredibly valuable what we're doing. And if they don't understand what we're doing, they can't care about it. And so without further ado, we're going to go into my top tips for science communication. My number one tip for everybody on this call in this room is that you need to know your audience. Knowing who your audience is more important probably than many of the other tips I'm going to give you. And it's important because the way you communicate with a middle schooler or a high schooler or an adult or a young adult or a child is going to be different than how you communicate with your colleagues. It's going to be different. So depending on who you are communicating with, you have to do a different kind of legwork to make sure that you are going to say what you need to say about science in a way that it can be understood. I also really, really want to ask right now, does anybody know why I underlined the word with? I can't see everybody, so hopefully Amber can see some, if anybody has some hands or some in the chat.
I'm looking. Or you can throw it in the chat. Oh, okay. So John mentioned operational definitions, personal opinion, one of the greatest gifts of science communication.
Okay.
Melanie mentioned it's a conversation, not a lecture.
Yes,
I like
it
it.
is a conversation, not a lecture, right? Because
Taylor,
if you're talking, oh,
yes,
go ahead, keep
sorry.
going.
Taylor, I love this. Taylor mentioned it is a two-way street, not just a sit and get. I like this.
Yep. If we're talking at somebody, we can't force them, right? We can't force anybody to hear or understand or consume what it is that we want them to. And so if we're having a conversation together, we can find common ground. We can find where we might make those mistakes, and we can do a much better job. And so
there's three more if you'd like to hear
okay,
really quick.
yeah,
Okay,
go for
because
it.
they're really good. Lasonia mentioned reasoning together with them. Jeremy mentioned each audience is unique, different education backgrounds.
Yep.
And Sydney mentioned sender and receiver. Communication goes both ways.
Yes, yes, it does. And all of those are like key, really, really important things to communication, to all communication. But even more so with science communication, where there's so much more that the majority of people don't really understand. Okay. My example, to go back to this audience size here, is that, and not my things, there we go. Okay, so if you are talking to a child, for example, and you're telling them, I'm going to the dentist today to get a new crown. The child's perspective, the only crown they know of is the actual crown that you wear in your head. And so they're sitting there going, oh my God, my mom's going to the dentist. I didn't even know she had a crown. But somehow the dentist is going to do something with this, right? And so you have to be very aware of the language that your audience has, their understanding of the words that you're planning to use. So that way you can make sure that when you say you're going to get your crown work done, that they have in their mind, it's not your crown, it's your tooth. You're getting your tooth worked on, and it's probably going to be your big tooth that you're getting worked on. Okay, so you really, really have to think about your audience and really, really make sure you're meeting that understanding with the words that you choose to use. Another thing is that most people just want to know one thing. And I know that we talk about this being somewhat selfish, but the truth is that it's not. We do want to know how something is going to affect us. So that way we know what actions we can take. So we know what we might need to care about or what we might need to think about. And without it, it's really hard to feel connected to that topic. Tip number 2 is, what do you want them to know? Do you want to educate them? Do you want them to advocate for you? Do you want to raise awareness? Do you want to build trust? Do you want to influence policy or research? Do you want to encourage change? Do you want to be part of a dialogue? All of these need to be thought about before you ever start delivering that message. So that way you can tailor your message to that goal. This way, when somebody hears what you're saying, They know exactly what it is that you're hoping to achieve and what they should do with that information. It's hugely important. Tip number 3 is probably one of my favorites. It's the point of reference, okay? We all have our own viewpoints, our own experiences, and they color what we think or know and what we understand. So both of these gentlemen in this cartoon are right? One guy is really seeing 4, and one guy really is seeing 3. They're both right. But unless they have a conversation about that, they're not going to recognize that the other perspective is valid, that it needs addressed, and maybe changes the conversation that you have. It's really, really important for scientists in particular to remember that the majority of people that you're communicating with don't have a science degree. So the number, according to the National Center of Education Statistics, and they last updated these in 2019, the number of people who pursue a higher education degree and earn it in STEM is about 23% of people. So 77% of the people that you are coming in contact with have not had science since their freshman year of college and maybe high school, for a whole bunch of people who do not have those advanced degrees. So for me, working in this field, that's biology driven, right? I last had biology as a freshman in college, and then I didn't have to take another math or science to graduate because I tested out. So the rest of my courses were all in the arts per se, okay? High school, we had biology freshman year of high school. And after that, it was physics and chemistry. And so the last time I had to think about those things or understand any of those was a really long time ago. And that's a huge amount of the audience that you guys speak to every day. Tip number 4, context. I know I said earlier that that was the most important thing, but this is really one of the most important things. They're all important, so I'm just teasing. Without context, if we're not giving context or learning context, we're missing half of the story. So for example, when I was at the School of Natural Resources, this is Dr. Trish Freeman. She is a bat researcher. And at the time, I got a phone call from the museum that said, oh my God, Trish Freeman just got a bat named after her. You should do a story. And I was like, well, yeah, of course I'm doing a story. That sounds awesome. So I arranged a sit-down interview with Trish, and we were sitting there and we talked for about an hour. She told me all about this really cool species and about their cute little dog faces and what they eat and where they sleep and all of those things. And at the end of the interview, she said, there are only about 6,000 mammal species on Earth. Unlike with insects, it's rare to discover a new mammal species today, let alone get to name one. This wasn't a question I had even considered, but her saying this changed my story from just being a cool story to being a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Like, I will never again have this opportunity to write this story. The university will never again have this opportunity to write this story. This is a once-in-a-lifetime chance, but I had no clue that it was a once-in-a-lifetime chance. And thank God she said that, or I would have missed the bigger story. I would have missed the story completely, honestly. But I didn't know what I didn't know. And neither will your audiences either. You can't ask if you don't know what you don't know. Tip number 5, avoid jargon. We're gonna take a little segue here. We're gonna watch a little bit of Alan Alda. He has his own SciComm organization now, where he goes in and he trains folks. And we're gonna watch him because we're not gonna watch from the full beginning, but at the beginning he says, you know, we all have jargon in every industry. I have jargon in my industry. You all have jargon in yours. And the point is to save time, right? When you're talking with colleagues, it saves time to use the jargon word rather than the paragraph or the 2-page or the 5-page description of what that word means. However, it's important that we don't let it get in the way of when we're trying to convey meaning.
Show business has it, movie making. Take this gobo and put it on the Century over there and hurry up because this is the martini shot. And while you're at it, bring me a half apple. Well, that's not understood to most people. And it's crystal clear to somebody who's been on a movie set for a while. I guess I have to explain it or people will be writing you letters saying, well, what does all that mean? A gobo is a thing that blocks out light. A century is a century stand made by the Century Company many decades ago, and their name is on the stand. It's a stand that holds up a light, or a gobo. The martini shot is the last shot of the day before you go home and have a martini. And a half apple is a box half the size of an apple box that you can put things on, like people who are too short. So that's jargon for the movie set. But jargon has another evil use, aside from separating us from one another. And that is that when we want to use it to make ourselves look really smart. I'm smart, I talk like this. You can't really talk like this, so you're not as smart as me. A lot of us do this unconsciously, and it's not necessary. We get more done if we open ourselves up. It's really fun to be on the verge of saying something that is probably not going to be understood by the other person. And to say, wait a second, how can I say this in really plain language? And if we do that, sometimes we learn more about the jargon than we thought we knew. We humanize it, we reduce it to the simplest concepts. What are the concepts that really matter in this? And then the jargon sometimes gets cleaned off and polished of some of the luster of highfalutenness that doesn't help. It doesn't help the jargon be helpful. The choice of words does.
No, so what he's saying is that, we can use jargon and it might save us time in attempting to convey or attempting to talk about something. Now, what it's really doing is just putting a barrier between you and that other person, between you and the person who you want to be excited about what it is that you're doing. And so if we're using our words to separate, we're attempting to teach rather than attempting to connect. And then it's really just kind of pointless, right? Because your audience isn't understanding what you're trying to say. And so you've wasted a lot of your time and a lot of their time. And neither one of you came out with any further than before. It was just pointless. So tip number 6 is to make it accessible. Now, if you've met me, you will probably hear me say, or probably have heard me say, I hate viscerally when somebody says they're going to dumb it down. You're not dumbing it down by making it accessible or making it in plain language. What you're doing is opening it up for somebody who doesn't have your experiences. And that is so, so valuable because we all shine in different ways, right? I'm an expert in some things and you are an expert in other things. And just because I don't know your things doesn't make me dumb or stupid. It just means I haven't been exposed to it yet. And so by opening it up, I have the opportunity to grow. And hopefully we can exchange roles and you have an opportunity to open up and I can learn as well. We can open up our language or make it more accessible with a few key things. The first one, of course, is, and I talk about this a lot, as a journalist, we were always taught never to use the scientific phrase. You always use the common phrase or the plain language phrase. And I recognize that when we're attempting to do science communication and we want somebody to learn about that word as well, we want it to become a part of their vocabulary, that we're going to use it. But what we need to do is use it second. So we lead with the common phrase or the plain English, and then you say, and that is this scientific phrase. And when you do that, you've led somebody into understanding what this thing is and then told them what its name is, rather than telling them what the name is and they spend all this time going, I have no idea what that is. And then they might not even hear that you're going to follow up by describing what that thing is afterward. They've missed it because they've been too busy trying to figure out what you attempted to say, what they didn't know, and what they should have known. The next thing is to do your best to communicate at a 5th to 8th grade level. I will be honest and tell you I'm not a big fan of the online tools. And I'm also not a big fan of somebody saying, oh, if I could tell my mom, because my mom's a smart lady too. And she knows vocabulary above the 5th to 8th grade level, right? But what I do love about this concept or this idea is that you're trying to take something and make sure that if you bumped into an 8th grader on the street, that you could in fact inform them about this process and maybe excite them about what it is. You want to make sure that they can understand the majority of the things that you were saying, so that way they can come along for the ride. And if not, you're leaving them behind. And that's not very effective science communication. And then the third way that we can make sure that we're making things accessible is to go back to those tips 1 through 5. Really thinking about what will our audience understand? What is their background understanding already of this issue or this topic? And how can I improve or enhance what they already know? And if we're really thoughtful about what we're saying and how we're saying it, they're going to be along for the ride. We want to make sure when we're doing this too, that we're very sensitive about how we go into things. I am direct to a fault sometimes. And I know often in the science industry, people are direct as well. We want to be really careful that when we're attempting to connect or communicate with somebody, that we're being sensitive to how we're saying things. So, for example, I knew a climate scientist who was a phenomenal presenter. They were able to really explain these very complex things about climate by using references and examples from everyday life, which is really wonderful. But after a presentation, when someone would approach and they would ask, well, what does this mean for me? The answer sometimes was, well, I don't know what's important to you. That question in of itself does need to be asked. But if you can lead into that question, instead of it throwing up a barrier where you feel like, well, crap, I don't know what to say next. What's important to me? A lot of things are important to me, right? But had there been an example like, well, I know because of climate change that we're going to have more four-foot snows and we'll be able to go sledding more often. What's something that's important to you? She would have had a way to back into that question and then really make the answer something that was personal to that person, enhance their understanding, and made them care about the topic even more than they already did. And I know that 4-foot snow is not good in most regards. I just happen to like sledding. It's also important to really remember that science isn't black and white. We tend to think of it as black and white, as we either had a result or we didn't have a result. But it's really not black and white. And the way we talk about it doesn't have to be black and white either. And in fact, the more we can talk about the gray space, the better off we're going to be. They say that as well because sometimes, like going back all the way to the crown reference, sometimes we have to use different language that maybe isn't quite as accurate scientifically, but is more accessible and provides more understanding to more people. So having a very rigid line about what words can and can't be used just throws up that barrier again. And our goal is to take down the barriers so we can enhance understanding. Tip number 7, your job is to be real and enthusiastic. When you're your authentic self, you're going to do a much better job of connecting with that other individual, building that relationship. And then you should also tell stories. So we're going to take a very quick dive into another video. I promise it'll be quick, but I just love Mary so much that I have to share her authentic self. And then we'll have a little quiz after. If I can get it to play. No, it doesn't want to. Okay, well, we will.
If you want to, Shawna, if you want to drop that link in a browser and reshare, you're more than welcome to, if you want to try that.
It's like I put it in there, assuming this would happen.
Because that was a pretty good lead up, and now I'm really curious.
She's so amazing. Oh, come on. Okay, here we go. Here's Mary. Can you guys still see that?
So you'll have to unshare your current screen and then reshare that browser.
Okay.
There we go.
Do that. Hang on. Here we go.
And Donna says we do want to see it, so we are being patient. Okay.
Okay.
Excellent.
All right. So here's Mary.
Okay.
If they have little tiny beaks, They need baby food, little tiny fish. So they need an active fishery, a reproducing fishery. So little fish when they're babies and they have tiny beaks, and as their beaks get bigger and longer, they can eat bigger fish. Sort of like, I am an ornithologist, along with a whole bunch of other stuff. I'm an ornithologist, but conservation biologist and behavioral ecologist and stuff. But birds are my focus. Get the pin feathers, get some feathers. We would go on vacations to Colorado, and that was my favorite thing ever to do. And so I knew I liked to be outside. I knew I liked to do things like that and to watch animals and to interact with animals. So I knew it had to be biology. I knew it had to be animal biology, probably something outdoors and something interactive actually with the animals. I'm trying to think of back Mrs. Caldwell, the teacher that was my important memory from elementary school. When I do assume the role of being a mentor, I hope I'm able to be the sort of mentor that I had always wanted, that I'm able to be somebody else's Mrs. Caldwell. If I can be that sort of a mentor, I think that's the sort of situation I would have thrived in and probably did thrive in. And I'd like to do that same sort of thing. What sort of education?
Okay, we're gonna stop there. Let me stop my screen share and then redo my screen share. Hopefully it's in the right spot still. Great. Okay, so our quick discussion points. Okay, so like Mary, did she get extremely scientific about talking about the birds and what they eat? I'm gonna go with no, right? She didn't feel it necessary to inform us about each one of those steps or what they were called. But it's impossible not to remember that those birds have little beaks and they'll eat little fish. And as their beaks get bigger, they're going to eat bigger fish, right? You immediately are going to remember she didn't bother to be pretentious about what she knew. And she was a very smart lady. She made it accessible to everybody. And then, I have to ask too, like, who were the informative people in her life and the reason why she decided she wanted to be an ornithologist? Does anybody remember? You can drop it in the chat. I have the chat box open this time. Yes, Miss Caldwell, right? Miss Caldwell. And what did she do as a child that made her think she might be interested to start with? And then Mrs. Caldwell kind of lit the spark a little bit further. She went on family vacations, right? Where they went outside. Okay. So we know quite a bit about Mary and how she functions and why she chose what she chose. Because she was willing to be her authentic self. She's willing to share. She's willing to connect with you. And that makes it super, super effective in the long run. Those stories are at the root of our ability to communicate and understand what's going on around us. And the truth is, the research shows, and I didn't put the statistics in here, but they also help us remember. So you guys may have noticed I've been telling a lot of stories, right? Because I know at the end of the day, you're not going to remember my slides, but you might remember my stories. Okay, tip number 8. Check it. Check your ego at the door. Okay. Ego is a very small word with a huge amount of destructive power. Okay. It can blow up a relationship in a second if you let it. And so it's super important to just check your ego at the door and have those conversations with your audiences rather than assuming you know what they know or what their life experiences are or how smart or stupid they are. Ask. Just ask. Don't assume. I know this is being recorded, so I won't ask, but I'm pretty sure everybody in this room knows what assume does to you and me. So make sure you're not making those assumptions, that you're checking your ego at the door, and that you're building those connections with the audience you're trying to reach. Tip number 9, which is kind of repetitive from what I just said, ask. Just ask. We don't know that other person's knowledge. And if you don't ask, you're never going to know. So you might just keep making assumptions and keep talking down to them in a way that, again, builds that wall rather than builds a bridge.
Shawna,
Yes.
can I share a quick comment on that one? Because I just
Yes.
have to. I think that ask is such an amazing tip, but I would also say we forget a lot, especially when we're dealing with students and kids. I think we often forget. If you go back one slide, sorry.
Yes, I'm sorry.
This one, we don't know the other person's knowledge. I've found that often we assume as adults when we're talking to kids, we assume they have no knowledge. And even if it's not scientific knowledge or accurate knowledge, they still have a frame of reference for what we're trying to speak about. And so I think this tip is also equally important, also when being extra mindful to employ it when you're talking to students and kids too, because it's just so empowering to ask, what do you know about this? Even if it's hardly anything, they still have thoughts and are curious. It's a good way for connection. I just had to throw that in there for educators and communicators working with kids. Don't forget this one. It's really
Yeah.
important.
I love that too, because it's so often when I see my kids, they're able to make connections about natural objects that I don't. Probably because I haven't for so long, but they'll see one thing and they can map that kind of response to another animal or to another situation where it's like, oh my God, I totally missed that. And if they had not had that platform to share that, I would have lost out.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so that, yes, that is hugely important. So that's a big one. Okay. Going back on track, tip number 10, keep it simple. When I say keep it simple, I say you're not gonna educate in one session, right? So stick to one to three key things that you think that the audience that you're trying to connect with could walk away with that day. 1 to 3 things that might grow their understanding that day. And then don't be surprised if next time you see that group, they only remember one of those things. You might have to go back and do, just a little bit of a shift, because they're remembering some key things that either they resonated with their experiences or their level of understanding. But it's unlikely all 3 of those things would occur. It's unlikely all 3 of those things are going to occur. For some, it might. So it's really important to really research what it is that you want to say and stick to that, and use examples, use pictures, use storytelling, use video, use any communication tool you think will help cement that key point with that audience. And usually try to use a way that they would most appreciate. So we talk a lot here where we would like to get some of our communications efforts or our science out in front of ag producers. Well, the truth is that a video is probably not a great way to do it, but radio probably is. Ag producers are in their trucks or their tractors a lot. They have a lot of time to listen to the radio. And so a radio spot might be the better tool for that message. Okay, tip number 11. I have been telling you the whole time, keep it simple, keep it accessible, keep it whatever. But I'm also going to encourage you to also dive deep. So if you're not diving deep periodically, if you have a mixed audience, you're going to lose the people who have more knowledge about that particular topic. And you're going to lose them. They're going to check out. They're not going to listen to anything you say. So you need to give them a little bit of a deep dive, but then you need to come back up for the people who have less understanding. The same thing applies to people who are in new situations. If you're not diving deep periodically and then coming back up, they're also missing out on that potential to understand more context. So you want to make sure you have this little bit of a balance between keeping it accessible, but also making sure you're opening the door a crack so they can see the potential for growth or the potential for more understanding and are excited to keep going. This is my picture weeds to remind you to get into the weeds once in a while. Okay. Tip number 12, and we are getting very close to the end. Talk about the scientific process. Why is this so important? So I'm going to go back and throw myself under the bus. So journalist, right? We get the AP Newswire comes across the desk and you are getting all of a new study says wine is good for you. A new study says wine is horrible for you and your heart. New study says chocolate is amazing and you should have a piece of chocolate every day, right? So you see these things and they're coming across the desk and you're like, oh, this is exciting, great. But you totally forget that science is kind of a spitball test, right? We're doing research and we're doing it over and over again, and we're seeing where the majority of the dots are falling. And that's when we can start to make decisions about what something is or isn't doing, what it is or isn't doing. And people like me who last had the scientific method in middle school, you forget about that process. So every once in a while, you have to remember to say, this is one thing, but we're still learning more. So that way people remember it's part of a continuum. It's not, this is the thing, it's part of a continuum and it's going to change because that's the purpose of science. Okay, and then my last one. So I'm fond of doing a one more thing, kind of like Steve Jobs, other than mine's not really quite as great as his. I'm not going to reveal an iPhone. Mine is, it's all about the relationship. I cannot say that enough times. It is about the relationship that you are developing with that person. And Amber, I see, is that a wave, a clap, or a comment?
It's a clap. It's a yes.
It's a clap.
Yes,
Great.
yes.
Yeah, it's all about the relationship. You know, if we're not developing that relationship, we're not communicating effectively. And that's why it's just so very important to make sure we're putting effort into each one of these steps. Now, Amber heard me yesterday say I got to hear Melissa Marshall speak a couple of, well, quite a while ago at this point. But she gives TED Talks on science communication. And in her presentation that she gave, she had one slide where the only words on that slide was science not communicated is science not done. So if we're sitting on the science and we're trying to hold the scientific language and all of the research results and equations we're using to prevent us from talking about science in a way that general audience can understand, is it really being done? Is it really changing what we want it to change? And the answer is probably not, right? And so with that, let's have a discussion. Does anybody have any questions or anything they would like to chat about science communication, or maybe just share as well your love of science communication and how you got there?
As people are maybe thinking and mulling this over, because we have a really nice time to discuss, I was wondering if for some of your tips, I was thinking it would be cool to see an example or hear an example. And so maybe if you can, off the top of your head, think of an example for, I'm thinking of, what was the tip? Maybe the one where you do layman's terms first and then define, like if you have an example of what that might look like.
Yeah. See, now you're putting me on the spot for
I know, I'm trying to remember all your tips. It's like we need Shawna's 11 or 13 tips.
Yeah, I would say, no, that's a jargon example. Let's go with a jargon example.
Yeah, any example you have for some of your tips, I'd be down. Thank you.
I'm not throwing Game of Parks under the bus, I promise. But we use the phrase a lot, socially acceptable levels. And that's not a phrase or a term that your general audience is going to come across ever. So when we say we manage animals for health and socially acceptable levels, it makes sense to people in this world, but externally of that, they have no idea what that concept really means. And what that really means is we're trying to reduce conflict, right, between the people and the animals. And so if we were to use that phrase, we could back into it to merge these two examples. We could say in writing that we manage animals for their health and also to reduce human and animal conflict. So it's a little bit more clear to your general audience's understanding of what we're really trying to achieve, rather than saying some people really like this animal and other people really hate it, and we're trying to hit a target somewhere in between. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. So Taylor mentioned best tips for short posts, such as on Facebook, which social media science communication is probably its own presentation, which is really important, but this is good. How do we best make a short text, but have a link for further information? Do statistics, scientific name, common name work best? Maybe, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I do have many thoughts on that. Yes, social media would be its own unique beast. And to go back to tip number one, honestly, it depends on who your audience is on social media. So we have a couple folks at the university who like to post animal tips But when you're speaking to an audience of other people with a doctorate degree in science, or in wildlife biology, for example, those people don't necessarily need wildlife tips. And so going back to who is following you will help dictate what that post might look like. For game and parks, we generally like to share because our audience is quite diverse and quite a range of people who just camp or just hike to those who do hunt and do fish. So we're always attempting to kind of thread the needle where we use a unique photograph of an animal or a really beautiful photograph of an animal. And then we try to back you into like, you want to develop that care for that animal. So you want to personalize it as much as possible. So hit them with a snazzy something and then lead into the scientific piece. I know that's kind of the opposite of what we think we need to do, but when we're introducing that concept, we want them to care and then we want them to learn for social media.
That's excellent, Shawna. Care and then learn. That's something that we talk about a lot in our division of how to engage everybody, but especially also youth in ecological education. Michelle asks, what are your thoughts on making connections through silly analogies? The one I did was on energy transfer and said, think about if someone slapped you across the face, what would you feel? This has stuck with my students and they understand that they are feeling force and heat transfer. We're struggling to understanding that energy is changed to multiple areas rather than just direct. So yeah, the silly analogies. What are your thoughts on that? I think that's a good one.
Yeah,
Honestly, it
I
stuck
love
with
that.
them. As long as they're not demonstrating, I think that's great.
Yeah, I don't think there's any problem with that. If it's something that's going to help them remember, go for it, as long as it's appropriate for the audience you're with. So you want to be cognizant of using certain silly analogies that a group of people might find offensive. So you really, it goes back to that audience again. Be aware if it's something you know that they would not be offended by, feel free to do it because it's going to help them remember. And it also helps relay the information you're really trying to convey.
Yeah, that's good. And silly or not, I think analogies and metaphors are a way of doing some of the tips you're saying, which is just translating meaning to something that they understand and care about. So they're, if you're talking about a system and then you're relating it to a car, like most people are familiar with what a car, something like that, relating it to something that they're understanding. That's good. And then Kristen Carter, who is also on our communications team here at the agency, she mentioned posts that grab attention first and offer up the info later are best. Humor or weird and interesting facts using common terminology has a best success rate. And she did say National Park Service sets a great example. I'd agree. I love following their stuff.
Did anybody, okay, I have quit screen sharing so now I can see all the little hands. Did anybody see the National Park Service's recent post about the stratigraphy of it was like a dating profile thing where it was like, ooh, I met this layer, and it was really, really hilarious. And obviously it's been a month or two and I'm still remembering that, well, loosely remembering that post, but I know I can find it and go learn about the rock layers. Just super fun and unique and weird. And then you as a person don't have to remember everything. You just have to remember how to go back and be able to find it.
That's excellent. I like that.
Okay. And Melanie, it looks like you were raising your hand, possibly.
Yes. Melanie, go for it. Thank you.
Well, first I want to just say thank you for talking about storytelling. Robin Walkimmer is one of my heroes and she does a really good job I've learned so much from her through her storytelling. That was a good example. And then I have a question about talking with young children about climate change. How to go about that without creating too much anxiety. Do you have any tips for that?
Yes and no. And I say yes and no because I think it somewhat depends on the child. Like my children have learned about climate change in very a little bit black and white terms at the moment because they're still young, they're 7 and 9. And so they learned about electric vehicles, and they learned about wind power, and they learned about solar energy. And my daughter came home convinced that we needed to go out and buy tomorrow an electric car. And then my husband tried to explain that, you know, the battery itself contributes to climate change and blah, blah, blah. And it got very complex very quickly. She is not currently worried about, she's not currently worried about mass destruction. Or massive floods or more tornadoes. She's just very aware of her little bubble of what that might look like. And then she's aware of this as a grander concept. So I think it will depend on the age group you're trying to reach, their understanding. And then also whether or not that's a child who is more inclined to feel a lot of worry, which is not something you would necessarily know. So you will have to kind of thread the needle and make sure there's a balance. So the climate scientist I spoke about before, she would always end on a high note. So she would say, we're going to experience more of these things, but I know humans are incredibly resilient and incredibly creative. So we're going to find a solution, like point blank, we're going to find a solution. And so that was like this, okay, so these things might happen, but we're going to be compelled into action to find a solution, and it's going to be okay.
That's excellent,
But-
Shawna. Yeah, thank you. That's good. That's on a lot of people's minds. So that was a great answer on the spot. And thanks, Melanie, for that question. And thanks for mentioning Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's fantastic. And if you haven't read Braiding Sweetgrass, put it on your list for 2023. It's fantastic. Brooke mentioned, what would you say is the difference between developing our vocabulary to be understood better versus using jargon? Maybe there's no difference at all, and it's really about being very intentional to be able to keep two sets of language for the same things we work with. That's really good.
Yeah, keep both sets. Keep both sets. You need the jargon in your workplace, probably. You don't need the jargon on the street. So depending on, you need them both, moral of the story. So keep them, embrace them both, and just consider yourself to be bilingual in that regard.
That's good. It is about two different languages, really,
Mhm.
in a sense. That's a really good question. And then Sydney asks, when writing in science, do you find that weaving in personal anecdotes or stories into the science article is well received? Or do people just want the science? She said, what your goals are and who your audience is will probably play into my previous question.
Yeah. I don't, research paper, obviously you're not going to do that. Alternatively, if you're doing a blog or a press release, we also tend to avoid, so like for a press release for research, for example, we're just letting you know the main takeaway of that research, and then we're telling you how we did it. So in general, we're avoiding anecdotes unless something really, really phenomenal happened. Everything went wrong, 7 people broke their legs, etc. And it becomes an important part to like how the research was collected and used. That said, if you're writing a blog, I would 100% use personal anecdotes about what happened to you in the field while doing this research or while doing this science, because like I said, most people don't have a scientific education. They're not in a scientific field, they're not practicing science. So we really don't know what it looks like to do science. And so when you tell those anecdotes, we are able to better map a picture of what this looks like and how it's done over time.
That's very good. Excellent. Lasonia asked, or she mentioned, think about the trees as they contribute to oxygen, the importance of planting a tree. If one person can plant 1 tree or 2 trees for their contribution to oxygen, which it will also rain. This is a family affair. So maybe just thinking about our roles in science communication and, you know, the importance of having those conversations. That's good. Thank you, Lasonia. And then Jeremy mentioned, as a meteorologist, what are your thoughts on how well we, the weather enterprise as a whole, go about communicating information during severe weather events? Anything that can be improved? What a question.
Oh man.
It's kind of like an immediate need, communication. It's an immediate need at that point, you know?
I know. Yes, I was trying to think back to the last time I had to retreat to my basement and if I felt I had any critique.
Jeremy, also, if you want to take yourself off mute and expand on this question too, you absolutely can.
Yeah, that would be lovely because it's like when you're in that moment, I have never once felt like I was being over or under communicated to in that instance, but I'm
Mhm.
also aware that it's changing. And so like that continual conversation over the TV or the radio, like I'm aware that you're giving me new information every however many seconds, so that way I can still stay safe.
Mhm.
But I've never bothered to ask my children what they thought.
And I was just thinking, you know, in other kind of communication that maybe you're speaking to or I'm thinking about for ecological education, we're trying to lure people to care about some things, whereas in a severe weather event, people are probably tuned in and are ready to receive your message. So it's not like
Mhm.
you're trying to connect
Or
with their
somebody-
values or things like that. It's like, okay, what is happening? You know, so Jeremy, I just wonder, like, I wouldn't know any answer to this, but you have the attention of the audience there, and I think, you know, that's what you can ask for. Lauren mentioned, I think U.S. National Weather Service, Omaha/Valley, Nebraska on Facebook is a great model of science communication. The graphics they use are user-friendly and provide a ton of information. I agree with that as well. Thanks for that, Lauren. I really like when it's not a severe weather event, the kind of things that they're sharing as well. And then Christy mentioned, yeah, I think that point Shawna mentioned earlier, what this means for you is helpful. Many people still don't know the difference between a watch and a warning. Oh, that's good.
That's very true. That's a good point. And that would be helpful information. I know the tendency of some people in my life is to go to the door to watch when they should go to the basement.
That's what a watch means, right? You go out and watch in Nebraska.
You know, and so having that very clearly defined course of action one should take, I think that is helpful.
That's excellent. Great question, Jeremy. Thanks. Michelle mentioned the only one that is a struggle to explain to students is what the percentages mean. Some think it is the percentage of the area and others think it is the chance of rain. Okay, so it sounds like there is some jargon, or it could be some jargon that maybe could be defined, not during a severe weather event. Maybe
Correct.
we get people safe, but in the interim between that, some education on what some of that might mean and how to help read that.
Well, and even I think the chance, well, like, for example, the drought center, and it took me a while to really understand this, and I worked for them. You know, the percent, like the categories themselves are based on all time, and every year you have a new year of time to feed into that data set, which kind of alters that, whether or not it's meeting that, you know, that percentage level of turning into the D4 darkest red color. But even then it's really hard to wrap your mind around. At a certain level, it's really hard to wrap your mind around, oh, the statistical odds of this happening compared to history. Or this is this bad compared to history. It's kind of a hard concept to hold in your mind, which is why repetition of that message is also important to repeat. Once you have something that does work and really conveys that message, to share it periodically, maybe not daily, but periodically, to keep it top of mind for people.
That's good. Great questions. Anybody else have any questions? And Shawna, you're doing fantastic, providing very great answers on the spot here. This has been one of my favorite lunch and learns, I have to tell you. And it's great that this is the last one. We're wrapping it up well. Any other questions from our audience while we have Shawna's time?
Yeah, and I took down my slides, so I'm gonna put, if anybody has questions later, I'm putting my email in the chat right now.
Excellent.
I'm typing it in correctly because I put screen sharing so I can see the people.
I also will, while you're doing that, I also want to let everyone know the two TED videos that she shared. I'll make sure to share them with you in the post lunch and learn email I'll send out this afternoon or tomorrow. And any other resources, Shawna, that you think are great for Science Communication 101.
Yes.
If you share them with me, I'll put that in the email so everyone can kind of dive into that.
That's fantastic. I do want to mention, and I didn't mention, the triple AS group, the Association for some acronym of science. They put out a ton of really great resources for scientists. You come in and do trainings if workplaces want to bring them in, or universities. But even without that, they put a ton of resources on their website, so you can go and watch and kind of have that experience. I'm kind of working through maybe some of the key points you want somebody to understand and how you make that accessible, which is hugely important, I think. And I will share some other resources with Amber, and she can include those in the email.
Excellent. That's fantastic. Thanks, Shawna. I see one more. Vocabulary is always difficult with science because the only exposure to those words is in science class. Yeah, and I think you really touched on that a lot, and just not getting rid of jargon because it's important to you and the work that you do, or us, but just being mindful when we're using something that is probably perceived as jargon to non-scientists. That's a good comment, Michelle. And Sydney said, I love that you said, let's open it up, not dumb it down. Education and knowledge should be accessible to everyone. It's important to make people feel welcome and at our tables. Absolutely, Sydney. That was one of my favorite things too. And I remember hearing that at one of those science communication conferences, Shawna, and I have been preaching that it's not dumbing it down, it's making it accessible for the last several years, because I heard that and I thought it was a good message to get out there.
It is. It's like, and even when you say it to yourself,
Yeah,
like, because people tend to say, I'm going to dumb it down. It's also belittling the effort you're making
exactly.
to make it understandable.
No,
by
it's like a
what you're
skill
doing.
what you're doing. You're not
Yes.
dumbing it down. You're translating it to a new language right now for
Yep.
people.
Yep.
That's work.
It is work, and
Yeah.
and then the end result is really opening up that world for another person, which is like hugely powerful and amazing.
Absolutely.
It's a wonderful thing.
It's empowering for both yourself and them. It's great. And Michelle said, thank you so much. I think that's all the questions I'm seeing. So again, Shawna, thank you so much. This was fantastic. I know I took a lot and learned a lot. And Jeremy said this has been very enlightening. Definitely going to use these tips in future presentations. How cool. Thank you, Jeremy. I'll send everyone some resources and evaluation of today, and also a sneak peek at some of the 2023 schedule for this series going forward. I'm really excited about next year. So thanks again, Shawna. And
Thank you for
everyone.
having me, and thank you to everybody who was on today.
Yeah, thanks everybody for contributing. Bye.